introduction and adoption of ordinances or public hearings. We have no old business. We'll move into new business. Letter A, mayoral vacancy election. Okay, so we've gone back and forth about this. There is a new interpretation from our lawyer now. So when we first held the mayor pro tem election, the thought was that this was going to be until November 2026. The statute says that it should be filled, the charter says that it should be filled at the next regular state election. That was initially interpreted to mean when the state holds an election, but now if you would like to explain the new interpretation.
Well, so the original, the charter says what it says. At the next regular state election, we consulted with the county clerk and said, what is considered to be the next regular state election? He interpreted that question to be, when is the next election when the state has candidates or issues on the ballot, which would be in 2026, November 2026. That seemed kind of odd to me, because if you could only fill a vacancy once every 2 years, that would make it really difficult when you had midterm vacancies under the city's charter provision. So I went back and looked at the state election law, because I was pretty sure the term regular election appears somewhere in there. And so sure enough it does. There's a provision that actually lists for the state of Michigan the regular election dates each year. And there's one in May, there's one in August, and there's one in November each year. If you look at that in conjunction with the point of the provision, which is to fill a midterm vacancy in a council seat or the mayor position from the city charter, I think the better way to read that is that when it uses the term regular election, it's referring to that section in the statute. Those are the regular election dates that the state of Michigan provides for, and that it should be on one of those dates. The next one will be in May. So that was after my going back and looking at the statute, because again, what the county clerk typically only deals with those elections, so I think that's what the clerk's office had indicated when we did that. So
Yeah, what is the word state doing in there?
well, because the state of this has to do with the tortured way that the state has dealt with through legislation election dates, particularly for local offices and for things like school boards, municipalities. So if you look through the charter, there are other charter provisions that reference municipal elections, the city elections. The state has over the years, probably the last, I want to say decade and a half, has passed various statutes that have tried to push more of the local elections toward the November general election date, when there's going to be a slate of candidates for a whole host of other things on the ballot. For example, like with school board, and the way they would do that is they would pass a statute, or they have passed statutes at various points in time, and then they keep feeding back onto them with different dates where they say, you can by resolution if you are a village, or if you are a city, or if you are a township or a school board, and your terms are set to expire on odd years, right? So your terms are 4 years, expiring on the odd year, and are to be filled at the election in May or whenever it might be, that you can pass a resolution to extend out the terms or redo the terms for your offices, not by ordinance, not by charter provision, but just by passing a resolution in most instances, where you basically reset the dates that all of your people's terms expire on a particular board, and then have them expire at that November election. The idea being that a lot of municipalities would take advantage of that, or school boards, so that they would get the benefit of just being on the regular election, not having to fund their own local election. So because of that, if you were to look at your charter and some of the other provisions, like for example, the one that deals with primary elections, it's referring to things that don't exist anymore, like the local city election, the regular May city election. Those don't exist because you've changed the dates for those elections pursuant to those other statutes by way of resolution and otherwise, so that your terms all hit on that November election date, right? So that is part of the difficulty with trying to navigate this. So when they're referring to state election, the only other place that that term appears is in the general election law, where they say these are the state election dates. And it has those 3 dates during the year. And there's also a provision that says that if you have an election for a local office for a city, for example, it's to be determined by the city charter. Because cities and villages and townships each have different legislation and county boards of commissioners and school districts that deal with how their members are elected and how long their terms are and how many people are on the board, there's actually a separate provision for each one of those types of entities. So for cities, it says it's according to your charter if you have a charter, right? So the problem is your charter, again, references things that don't exist anymore. That's part of the issue with determining whether or not and when you would have a primary. So the only thing that's for sure, I think, is that there are 3 state election dates. There is a reference in your charter to the next regular state election. Those 3 dates are considered regular state election dates. So that makes some sense in terms of being able to fill a position. The question then becomes, if you need to have a primary, when would you have the primary? I think the language in the charter about when you would have the primary is kind of almost written out of existence in a way, from a timing standpoint, just because of the other things I just referenced in terms of all the changes to the terms and when you typically would have your election. So basically it's a big spaghetti mess, but I think that the clear thing is one of those 3 election dates you would have your election to fill a mayor's position, and the next one, if you go by the charter, would be in May.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I was looking at the election law. I saw regular election, state election, no regular state election. But I guess, yeah, you can intuit what that means. This is another thing we can add to our charter reform list. This could be a lot more clear. The next possible state election would make sense. But yes, we need to reform this charter. It's about 20 years old. I think actually Commissioner Ingalls was a part of that. This was a generation ago, right?
Well, that was a generation ago. Whether that was one of my items, I have to dig into my archives. There's a lot of cobwebs on some of that, so.
Maybe time for anyone. Any thoughts on this? Any questions? Any comments? Councilman Bentley?
3 points. It's fair to say it's ambiguous.
I don't think it's ambiguous because, again, the only place where the term regular election appears is in the state election law, and it sets forth those 3 regular state election dates. It doesn't use the term regular state election dates, but it sets out 4, except as otherwise provided in this section, an election held under this act, which is the Michigan election law, shall be held on one of the following regular election dates. There's the May, the August, and the November each year. So that's as close as you can get to matching up the language between the charter and state law as for when state elections are held.
So I think it's self-evidently ambiguous. And all the laws and the charter, it all disagrees. So, and I think part of the confusion is they're establishing the dates. So regular election dates, the intent is different than the next regular election. That's how I read it, be that as it may. Can we all agree that this is our decision?
Sure. I look at it typically when I'm looking at something like this, like from the standpoint of, based upon my experience, what do I know is the way that courts generally interpret these things, right? So if someone were to challenge how you chose to do something, how do I think a court would take a look at this language? I think the court probably would go through the same kind of analysis I just did, which is, it says the next regular state election, state law provides that any state election held in the state is going to be on one of these 3 regular election dates, and probably come to that conclusion would be the next one of those dates that would appear. Could you argue if you chose to do something different? It depends what that thing is that you chose to do and how different it was as to whether or not I could sustain it if somebody challenged it. I can't tell you that unless I knew the specifics and unless somebody actually challenged it and told me what grounds they were gonna try and challenge it, if you understand what I'm getting. So all I can do is give you advice based upon kind of what I think the way that would be analyzed by a court would be if they had to be challenged. You're free to do whatever you wanna do, it's my opinion, you're the legislative body. As I've said before, you can choose to ignore our opinions if you want to, and if somebody challenges it, we'll do our best to sustain the decision you make.
I'm sorry, one last thing. Can you characterize your recommendation as strong, super strong?
So yes, I think I just indicated, I think the one thing that is fairly clear is that it should be, as I read it, probably the May election. Now, the question becomes, what if you have petitions that put out where you have more than 3 people apply for the job? Under the charter, you're supposed to have a primary, narrow it down to 2. In that instance, I don't think you have to stick with the language in the charter because it really does not match up with the way the state election law currently sits. I think from that standpoint, you could treat the May regular election date as your primary date, and the August regular election date is the date when you're gonna have the election, if you have more than 2 people who file valid petitions. I can't give it, this isn't one where I can look at it and say definitively it says you're gonna do this, but I think it's fairly definitive in terms of one of those 3 dates would be the date that you have to fill it, and it says in the charter the next regular election date. So that would be, I'm fairly confident that you should do that.
Well, that's my hang-up, though. It doesn't say the next regular election date. It says the next regular election in the charter.
Well, but
Regular state election.
regular state
It's a
election,
little confusing
Not
word.
date, the word date is missing.
yeah, and that was, I had a discussion with the deputy clerk about that, right? That is an issue, the language doesn't exactly match up, but it does mention the term next regular state election. And in the state law, it says elections shall be held on these dates in the state of Michigan. Now, again, I can't tell you this is definitive, but courts, this is why they send you to law school for 3 years, right? Because there is a set of rules that courts are to apply in looking at legislation and what those terms mean. My guess is, knowing the judge you would have here, and knowing the way that this probably would be analyzed, that's likely, although not guaranteed, to be the way that a court would look at it if they had to. Does that mean anything? Probably not, in terms of someone would have to challenge it. I'm not quite sure what the basis of the challenge would be, in that if you chose to do it later, you just had the seat empty for a while. You see what I mean? So what is the damage or the harm here other than you just didn't have a mayor for a few months? If you were stretching it out to that November 2026 general election date, I think I would have a hard time arguing that that's the intent of all those provisions and the intent of the provision in your charter. Because that means, again, so I'm gonna go, the judge is gonna say, so you mean to tell me that the only time you could fill a midterm vacancy would be literally either the middle of the term or when the term had expired, right? Well, that doesn't make any sense, because you're gonna have up to, it's here, almost a 2-year gap where you don't have anybody in that position, and what the people are entitled to have their representative there. You could freeze out somebody in a ward if the council, if a council seat were left open for 2 years or a year and a half or a year, the people in that ward are only getting half the representation they're entitled to during that period. So I think that would be more difficult to sustain if you pushed it out like that. I think it's a little easier if you say, okay, well, we're gonna treat May as the primary and August as the election date. given what I just talked about, I think you can do that, and what's the alternative, right? Given the timing constraints you would have with having to have you'd have to get the petitions in by the end of January, then have a turnaround under the charter language, and have a primary in March, and then turn around and have the election in May. That'd be pretty tough to do, and I don't know that that serves anybody. And given that there are 3 election dates for elections in the state law, or the general election law, I think you can make that fly. And I don't think the Bureau of Elections would have any problem with that. If you did the May primary and the August election to fill the seat.
Okay, very good. Councilman Wolfram.
Is it possible that you would do a primary, that if you had 5 people running and then you just run them all in one election in August?
Except your charter says that you're supposed to narrow it down. It says you're supposed to have a primary if you have more than 2. Okay, the issue with that is when do you have the primary? Because it's got language about doing it in the March before the city election, which there isn't.
Do we have an example of a special election in which more than 2 people have filed? In your memory, Katie? No. Okay, any other thoughts? Councilman Morrissey?
As far as the special elections are concerned, the first time I was elected was for a 1-year unexpired term of the previous council member. So they can do that and have done it in the past. And then I was still eligible for 2 regular terms after that, because it was only a year. As far as the May date is concerned, I think that's would be very unfair to anyone. I don't intend to run for mayor. I can put that on the table right away in case anyone's curious. But I think it would be very unfair to prospective candidates to give them 2 weeks to get a petition going in the middle of January, which is the worst weather of the year. I think if we're going to do a special election, it would be the earliest would be August. Seems to me, if that's, I don't know if that's legal or not, but that would be the earliest I would want to do it. Give people a chance to organize themselves and get their petitions in and have a fair election.
And I think that you can make an argument that that's sustainable for the reasons I just talked about, right? Because of the difficulty timing-wise, because of the deadlines the state sets by which the petitions have to be filed, and that sort of thing. So I think when you're looking at the term, can I make the argument that next election means, for purposes of this, August? Okay. Because of those timing issues. And you're going to run into those. Certainly your charter would anticipate that. Certainly state law anticipates that, because you don't know when the vacancy is going to occur, right? You could have one that occurred 2 days before the petition deadline that the state sets. Even though the election's in May, the petition deadline's in January. Well, by the letter of the charter, you theoretically would have the election in May, but as a practical standpoint, you couldn't really do it.
Katie, or we have Abe here, how long do the citizens normally get to fill out petitions for regularly scheduled elections?
Usually it's what, two months,
Oh, 2 months.
roughly.
Yeah.
Okay. Councilman Bentley?
What does it cost the city and or the county to run a special election?
The cost of an election is about $6,000 to the city. And we have our new budget starts July 1, so anything after that will be on next budget. Anything before that is on our current budget.
And I will say early voting doesn't include local, so that cost would be, if it's state or federal, they do, but local they don't.
Okay,
So
we're having
do
nothing
that.
but special elections from here on out. Okay. Any other thoughts? One other thing to consider, if a member of council wins in August, then we have to have another special election. So we could potentially have a primary, a general, and then the next election after that would be a primary election citywide. So we'd run 5 elections in a row. I'm so sorry. Okay, any other comments? Councilman Saha?
Tom, thanks for your explanation. What action do we need to take tonight, if any?
So if you're gonna have the election in May, I think you would have to set the election for May, because you have that petition deadline at the end of the month. And there's a limited amount of time by which, I think already you've only got 2 weeks, right? So if you were gonna do it in May, you would have to do it now. If you were going to choose to do it later, then it's not such a pressing issue. And by the way, just so you know, that Mayor Pro Tem Palladino did reference charter amendments. I will tell you, there are other cities within this county that have charters that provide, for example, when the mayor dies or resigns, and there's a mayoral vacancy, the mayor pro tem becomes the mayor, and then they have a special election just to fill the council seat that the mayor pro tem vacated to become the mayor. So there are ways to address this that don't require having to fill potentially multiple spots.
Well, we're here now. Yeah, I saw the Litchfield and Reading, they just appoint their next council member. Consider that, yes.
So could we, if, let's say, Mayor Pro Tem Palladino puts his hat in the ring to be for the mayoral election, and we learn that, is there a possibility of a contingent election for if his seat is vacated, so we could do them simultaneously?
No, because his seat wouldn't be vacated unless he became the mayor.
Well, that's my point. So you'd be there if he wins, but if he doesn't win, thanks for your effort.
Yep, yeah, you can't do that, unfortunately. If you win, it is your seat, so.
Thank you. Well, I would submit then, so we have a full council with, hopefully Bob and Greg will be here on the 21st. Let's push this off until the 21st and consider voting on it for an August primary.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So then I guess do I need to make a motion to do that, or?
I don't think we have an August election on the table right now.
And did anybody actually make a motion to do anything with this? So you're just at discussion at this point. You actually don't have to do anything with it. It's an agenda item, but you don't have to make a motion.
Does anyone insist on a May election? I don't think anyone here likes the May election. Feels like a way to sneak things past the citizens.
And it's only 2 weeks, Mayor Pro Tem, it's not fair.
2 weeks isn't great. Okay. Do I have a motion? Does not seem so. Okay, good. Thank you, Katie, and yeah.
I'm sorry, I would like to request the city put this on the January 21st agenda.
Yes, let's add that to this old business to discuss an August primary election. Okay. Now, if we do it ahead of time, do we have to declare it as a primary?
Actually, the one thing that I think does still stick in terms of the way your charter addresses it is your charter only requires the primary if you get petitions for more than in this case for the mayor, 2 people. So if you don't have more than 2 candidates, you would set it as an election. If the clerk gets petitions for more than that, you would come back and then you would designate it as a primary. I think that's the approach to take.
Okay. Yes, Councilman Soha.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. If we just had the election in August, there was only 2 that submitted their applications to run, and Mr. Smith wins, when would Mr. Smith be sworn in?
After the election, there's a provision that I don't remember what it is, but I
The
think
Monday after the election?
Monday after the election.
Oh, well, we can't, oh no, you can probably certify in that amount of time, right? Without all the state requirements?
That would be the county that certifies, but.
Oh, it still requires that county certification, which would, okay.
Yeah, so once the election was certified, then you would be able to swear in whoever.
So probably 2 Mondays from the election. Okay.